I'll do a quick lead in. First of all, I sincerely appreciate both of you for being here this morning. Thank you very much. My name is Jay. I'm the sort of online editor. I work with David Vogel at California Management Review. He was incredibly thrilled to be receiving and publishing this piece. I think he felt it was very timely, very excited about the subject matter, and your comparison framing, I think, was very compelling. Your article is on dynamic capabilities in Chinese companies. And you begin your article by suggesting that the kind of prevailing narrative about Chinese companies being copycats or followers might not hold up anymore. And in some cases, these Chinese companies are actually pulling ahead technologically and leading in certain areas. Um, and I think a lot of the discussion in your article centered around both AI as a critical technology and the development of sort of ecosystem models within China as being a crucial component in this growing advantage. Could you perhaps begin by talking just a little bit more generally about what the article is about, your motivations behind it, and where you see the direction in the future for Chinese companies in this sort of competitive relationship with the United States?
Sure. Let me make a few general comments, then Annika, I'm sure, will chime in. First of all, I think Americans really need to understand that Chinese companies are definitely strong innovators, not just regular innovators. That they're actually pulling ahead, to use your term, because they have two things that really matter. They've got strong dynamic capabilities and they're very entrepreneurial. And secondly, they've got a longer term view. I mean, I think many U.S. companies are constrained by capital markets. There's plenty of long-term capital in America, but by the time it gets put in the hands of private equity funds and hedge funds, they manage to shorten it up, and that really compromises the business sector. And I think part of our purpose here is a wake-up call to U.S. companies that they shouldn't rest on their laurels, that they're really challenged across the board, but particularly in tech, which we've always thought that we were strong, and we are strong, but Chinese companies have caught up very, very rapidly and look like they might be driving ahead.
If I may add on that, I totally agree. This article, as you said, explores how leading Chinese firms are transforming from followers to global leaders. And one of the reasons is that they truly seem to have and use dynamic capabilities. And some of the things that we focus on in the article is how Chinese firms combine, as I said, AI, ecosystem orchestration, and those state-enabled strategies to compete globally and reshape the rules of business leadership. And I think that it's, as Professor David Teece said, China have been learning a lot from the American and from Silicon Valley for years. And I think this is a wake-up call that now we need to understand and learn, also from Chinese companies.
Thank you both. David, you mentioned something about kind of investing time horizons and having that maybe the pressure of private equity or private investment. Do you perceive there to be an interesting difference in terms of Chinese ability to scale with maybe a longer term focus than is present in the United States? And is there anything that U.S. companies or even regulators might consider when looking at Chinese companies and trying to decide what to implement in terms of changes domestically?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, China has got a longer term plan, and it's a national effort. It's not an individual private effort. So Chinese companies put the interests of China and global competitiveness front and center. It's something that many of our companies do, but there's no, coordinated effort to do so. And we rely a lot on our capital markets, which very good at moving capital around quickly. But I think when you're doubling down for the long term, you really require patient capital. And because of a number of things with respect to the way our capital markets work, American long-term capital in the hands of managers, particularly the hedge funds and the shareholder activists, get shortened up. And I think it's because we've overemphasized shareholder rights. I certainly believe in shareholder rights, but in fact, you have a bunch of traders masquerading as shareholders. They're not holders in the sense we think of. I think of a shareholder as someone who's going to hold stock for a year or two or three or four or five or maybe a generation. But in fact, most shareholders are in and out pretty quick. And marching down the road for shareholder rights, which I'm very much in favor of, we've not sorted out the traders from the shareholders. So we give the traders as much weight, if not more so, and they're in for a quick hit. And that causes companies to consider stock buybacks, pay dividends, and denude the company of the capital it needs to grow. And you look at private investment levels in the United States, they're not as high as they need to be to sustain national competitiveness. So there are public policy issues here as well. So your question is very, very much on target. It's not just failures in management. Management is not entrepreneurial enough. Boards don't allow managers to take the bold long-term bets. And it's in part because they got shareholder activists whispering in their ear, if you do that, we're going to throw you out. And so there's some very complicated governance questions here that really need to be examined more thoroughly than they have been.
Yes. And I would just back that up again regarding time horizons. I mean, China's governance model is known for and allows for this long-term strategic continuity. 5 years plan, as we know, state-backed financing, align corporate and national objectives. And many firms can invest on 10 to 20 years of horizons, while US companies then maybe face quarterly performance pressures, as we heard Professor Teece talking about. And this patient capital then enables those sustained innovation cycles. And what was really, I think, surprising, or it was surprising in the research and it's surprising in the article, is that this state alignment in institutional context can act as an enabler of agility rather than a constraint. And contrary to the assumption that government involvement stifles innovation, China's industrial policies, patient capital that we now mentioned a number of times, and national coordination have accelerated firms' dynamic capability development. And this multipolar reality shows that competitive advantage today may stem as much from, ecosystem strategy, execution speed, and this kind of coordination on a national level, firm level, as from frontier R&D.
Thank you very much. And Professor Steiber, could you elaborate a little bit more on the use of the dynamic capabilities framework within this article, how that guided some of your research?
Absolutely. So, as you know, the framework is including the sensing and seizing and transforming opportunities. And we see several examples through those 7 pairs that we present, how they have been using. For example, in the case of BYD, for example, and the vertical integration model, which could be thought as being maybe less dynamic and less flexible, they are extremely good at sensing and transforming. And by having those capabilities, they are extremely they are capable of both scaling and adapting, and still focus on creating this kind of integrated offering and focus on cost through the value chain.
Thank you. Professor Teece, do you have anything that you'd like to add related to dynamic capabilities in China in general?
Yeah, look, I think part of it's a mindset issues, and I think Chinese culture is very entrepreneurial. I mean, our culture is too, in large degree. Also, these companies are younger companies, and a lot of our companies are older. And when you get older, you tend to become a little bit more bureaucratic and a little bit more wooden. So So China's got newness on its side. But I would say the most important thing comes back to governance and goals and missions. I like to say sometimes that if you make profit, if you put profit as number one, you often end up in the long run making less profit. Look at the Boeing story. If you're more mission oriented, and many Silicon Valley companies are mission oriented, you make profits on the way to execute the mission. Having a mission brings people along, and I think we've gotten too narrowly focused on shareholder rights. I mean, I find it really alarming that a lot of pension funds, which should have a long-term view, actually line up with the hedge funds. And they got long-term retirement money, but in the hands of the retirement fund managers, it becomes short-term money, and they have no idea the negative consequences for the companies that they're dealing with and making threats to. So we've got some sticky issues to deal with there, and China doesn't have those issues, and they're plowing ahead. And it's alignment between a national mission to win and to establish global hegemony from it, or at least technological hegemony, and that makes a difference. U.S. companies do not wake up in the morning thinking about the United States of America. They wake up in the morning thinking about the next quarter and the quarter after that, maybe if you're lucky, and the quarter after that if you're very lucky. And the tenure of most execs is fairly short term, and they're loaded up with incentives to drive the stock price up in the short term. I think we academics contributed to this, quite frankly, by sort of I'll call it the Jensen Meckling sort of approach, that the fundamental problem of the corporation is an agency problem. We pushed all that out through research and finance and economics. The fundamental problem of the corporation, in my mind, is to how to create and capture value and sustain long-term competitiveness. But we've framed it the wrong way in academia. We've been teaching it the wrong way. And the dynamic capabilities framework is an opportunity, I think, for a reset. And that's why I'm pushing it as hard as I have. And that's why Annika and others have found it very useful as a lens to look at US versus China, because it all comes together where the rubber meets the road.
Let's see, I'd like to shift the discussion quickly over to AI, if you don't mind, and about the embracing of AI within China domestically. This is one of the areas I think we're seeing even in the news where it's kind of a fierce competition. Obviously, there's a great deal of domestic investment in the United States and also in China. How do both of you see AI as being a kind of pivotal or defining technology, and what's the relationship between each country and culture with that technology?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, sometimes we focus a little too much on who's developing the AI, and maybe the US has a slight lead in that regard. I think it probably does. But really what matters for business is who's implementing it fastest. And I think the Chinese firms are onto it, in part because they've got this long-term focus, in part because they really, really want to win at a global level. And there's a sense of urgency. Sometimes I don't think we have that sense of urgency, but there's no doubt that AI, and it's not just a tool. In my mind, it's a way to integrate the operations of an enterprise and tie it in better with strategy as well. AI can be a great enabler here, and those who figure out how to use it in that capacity are the ones that are going to get ahead. And of course, dynamic capabilities is in part about trying to figure this kind of stuff out.
Yeah, and it's extremely interesting topic. And my experience from the Chinese companies is that they view AI as an organizational core. And just to give an example that I saw myself, where the company has its own philosophy how you manage your business for scale, for innovation, for taking a lead. And now at this conference they call that 1.0. because now they presented the 2.0, and that meant that now AI is going to be integrated in everything. So they take this framework for how they manage the firm. And so the message is two here. Firstly, they think about management innovation, organization innovations in a way that I don't think I ever heard anyone in the Western world talking about it. I mean, the only thing we talk about is technology innovation per se, and it's like randomly happen, right? It's the right capital, it's the right leader, it's a serial entrepreneur, whatever, and then voila, it happened. We don't really talk about the management model behind it that actually made it happen. And so the Chinese companies, many of them have learned a lot from specifically Silicon Valley companies. And so they focus on more or less developing their own model, right? The management model for being extremely competitive and efficient, they develop that yearly, annually, think about continuously how to do more or less R&D on their own management model. And now it's to integrate into the core AI. And so we see that across platform, for example, TikTok's algorithms and Baidu's Apollo, Alibaba's cloud, and most of them are doing that. And so they are applying AI at a massive scale in a way that I mean, here we still discuss digital transformation and in best case AI transformation, and then we start focusing on should we do it in customer service, which is one of the first functions to start elaborate and testing, experimenting with AI, and maybe even agentic AI. But here we talk about you take our whole model and say, okay, now we're going to turn this into an AI world. How will we look at it?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that leads into almost a discussion of like maybe this upset that occurred with DeepSeek earlier this year, where it sort of revealed that the training costs for their model were substantially less. And I noticed you mentioned in the article this was sort of maybe a wake-up call to some Silicon Valley firms, where it's like, oh, perhaps there's a path forward via efficiency gains, and maybe these constraints on some of the things like the import of NVIDIA GPUs were acting like a motivator for further innovation. I'm wondering if you could speak to that just briefly as well.
Well, I do think we have to take into account that when export controls and things like that go on, that it does have knock-on effects, and it does motivate and attract capital in China, because the Chinese government, of course, is behind the private sector. In fact, you really can't tell the difference between the two in many ways. And so there's a level of determination, I think, to win that we don't appreciate. And so, when you design export controls, I'm not saying that one shouldn't never use export controls, but when you do, you've got to take into account the behavioral consequences. You can't take a short-term view of it. You've got to take a long-term view and look at how resources can be reallocated. And maybe it raises the cost of innovation for China, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the innovation won't happen. So we just need more sophisticated ways to think about all this stuff, and as we do it, certainly don't underestimate the entrepreneurial capacities and strong dynamic capabilities of many of these Chinese companies, and a government working in tandem with Chinese corporations is willing to provide assistance. I mean, we draw a much sharper line, a very sharp line between business and government. And we should understand that's not the way it is in China. And when we design policies, we need to take that into account.
Thank you. That's a great segue into a little bit more further discussion of governmental policy. Like speaking as you're saying, Professor, what do you think would be some maybe practical ways in which U.S. companies might engage with the government? What recommendations might they have to kind of co-develop supportive policy like that? Or is it maybe just not a culture fit for the United States?
Well, I think we have to re-engineer the way our capital markets work, to be honest. And maybe it's not a lot of re-engineering. We've got to, at minimum, tweak the system. I mean, let's take stock buybacks. They used to be illegal. And one small regulatory change, it wasn't even an act of Congress, turned it from being illegal to being virtuous. And indeed, in some cases, stock buybacks are virtuous. But in many cases, when they denude the company of the long-term capital it needs to innovate, then it has a nefarious impact on U.S. competitiveness and on long-term shareholders too, for that matter. I mean, witness both Intel and Boeing, which did significant stock buybacks and starve the investment machine. So there is a new reality that needs to set in terms of the way our capital markets work and what needs to be done to re-engineer them. And I don't see the attention being given to this except in a very sort of marginal kind of way. But we have to recognize that it's not just a failure of management that's causing U.S. companies to no longer be leaders. There's institutional issues and regulatory issues at work as well. I'm a little bit upset that nobody's called out management at Boeing. I mean, business school professors are asleep at the switch too. When you see classic cases of, it's not technical or legal malfeasance, but just very bad judgment and very bad decision making, moving the headquarters of Boeing to Chicago, away from the front line. These are all pretty transparent things that are going to have an impact on quality and just driving for efficiency over innovation. These attitudes, boards should be alert to. So nobody is focused on the real issues, which is good strategy. I mean, you want boards that have got people on board, yes, where there's diversity, but it's cognitive diversity that matters, and knowledge about business and strategy. And we have kind of muted boards in a way. And we've got a regulatory process that's not working as well as it should be. And we've got CEOs that got strong backgrounds in finance, but frequently don't have the technology chops to do what needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Steiber, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that specifically related to U.S. government and maybe corporate governance as well?
Yes, I do. As we know, government in China is playing, while the Western policy is more regulatory and reactive, the Chinese policy is maybe regulatory and very proactive. It's interesting because I know that in China, some of the smartest students are actually employed by government. So by coordinating, the Chinese model shows how policy coordination can accelerate this technological catch-up, but not just catch up, but also actually become number one in new areas. So I think there is something extremely important that Professor Teece is pointing at. The American government have been extremely supporting regarding military and military innovations, and a lot of our innovations that are worldwide and extremely disruptive, like the internet, has been part of that. And so, because there is this paradox that the government shouldn't be very involved, the market should actually be the ruling one, and it should be in the market forces. But in the military area, the government have been supporting and funding and having almost played a similar role to us as what China government is doing. But China government is more or less thinking about where should we as a nation lead. So take an even broader perspective, not just a military perspective, but where should we be the leader in the world in 5 to 10 years, right? And or even longer. So when they started to build up, for example, competences, the total update of the educational system, today they are pushing out, I don't know how many times, if it's 10 times more PhDs than America, right? And they also create incentives to have PhDs in certain adjacent area where we need more new competency, new technology areas, and so on. So they make sure it happens, right? They create the whole system supporting that the country can make and take the lead in those specific areas that they have decided to take a lead on. So it's interesting, as I was not born in the US, I think it's very interesting that the US government is doing that in certain areas like the military, but maybe not as broadly as the Chinese government is doing. And if you go to Europe, the government is actually much more involved, similar to China. And that is something that also shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, EU, for example, maybe they haven't been as effective because there's so many countries, but they definitely involved, and they have all those strategic initiatives, and they provide hundreds of millions of funding, right? We want research in this area, and we want to help startups in this country or whatever. And it's a lot of directions of support from the government. So maybe the American government, as you said, Professor Teece, maybe reevaluate, see what kind of governance that would be the best and most effective for the future to keep our leadership.
Yeah, but to be clear, we don't want to look more like Europe. Europe has zero productivity increase, and they've overregulated themselves, in my view. So we need to stick to a distinctive American model around, strong entrepreneurship and scaling entrepreneurially developed new companies. But I think as they get larger, we have to pay a lot of attention to governance and the way the capital markets and shareholder activists are actually forcing the hand of management in a way that's quite negative. So if we could get rid of that, I think if we could rebalance that and put entrepreneurial managers more in charge of building the company for the long run and incentive for the long run rather than for the short term, which is what we've done, I think you get much better results. So it's not about migrating to a European model. It's migrating away from a European model to doubling down on an intrinsically American model and fixing some of these things that have crept in because they are recent changes. The role of shareholder activists and so forth, they were not as influential 25 years ago as they are today.
And I also would like to add that Europeans are also looking at the Chinese government's model because they are similar in some way. They might not want to state that, but the Chinese government and policymaking have been, it's interesting to see how, try to understand more why it has been such a strong force for the country's development. And so the Europeans try to learn from that too.
Thank you both. I think this has been incredibly valuable. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but if you have any closing thoughts on the article itself, maybe some of these case pairs or any final takeaways for a managerial audience.
Well, one thing that I would say, which is very subtle, is that the role of debt we didn't really discuss very much here. And, China's success in part is because it has provided enormous amounts of funding, primarily, debt funding to companies to let them make the investments that they need to make. There's a negative side to that too, because a lot of that investment has failed. I mean, we're looking at successful Chinese companies, but there's many that have fallen by the wayside. And along with it, regional governments as well as national governments are holding tremendous amounts of debt. That hasn't fully come home to roost yet. And when it does, there may be some negative consequences for China, all of which is simply to say it's not about looking, imitating what Europe is doing or imitating what China is doing. It's finding our own distinctive way forward.
Yes.
that relies on strengthening our institutions and our education system. As Annika mentioned, we're not graduating enough engineers. We can't win in the technology world without, scientists and engineers and strong STEM education. We've got to go back to the education system, and throwing more money at it is not going to fix it. There are fundamental governance problems in our schools, and it's resulting in I'm sad to say it, but I don't think necessarily the teachers' unions are doing what is right for the students and for the country, and so we need more independence and more effort to focus on our national priorities in education. And absent that, we have no chance, particularly if we close the doors on immigration. So we've got to also open up legal immigration. I'm fully in favor of reducing illegal immigration, but that should be done hand in hand with increasing legal immigration to bring forward the talent that we need to power the enterprises that are going to continue to generate prosperity and hopefully for all.
I would just like to add to that based on the research and the article that we hope that you will read now as a listener now, I wanted to emphasize that some managerial insight for US leaders are three things that Chinese executives emphasize a lot. The first one is execution speed and cross-functional agility over bureaucracy. So in the Chinese companies, we talk much more horizontal communication rather than vertical communication. So we see this cross-functional agility a lot. We also see, of course, the focus on the execution speed. The next one is embedded AI in every process rather than siloed innovation labs or a certain part. And then lastly, that we maybe didn't discuss that much today is the ecosystem leadership. So we know that some of the Chinese companies in the study are using a vertical integration model, but they also have the 180-degree different other model, which is the ecosystem model, which have been extremely successful for many of the Chinese companies. And where you're partnering with suppliers, startup, and even competitors. So these lessons suggest that this visionary alignment, a rapid iteration can coexist, and is a valuable takeaway for American firms seeking agility at scale. I'm a true believer that innovation is not enough for one organization anymore. You need to execute, scale, and also to be able to innovate. Today, you need to do it together. So you need to start working much more effectively in ecosystem. And we see many of the Chinese companies that are extremely sophisticated in their ecosystem management, much more sophisticated than any model we find either in the US, which is more platform-based, or Europeans, corporate startup models. In China, we see industrial ecosystem models where they innovate together, they supply together, they innovate together, they go to market together, and they could definitely then scale very much faster.
My last thought would be, ecosystem, of course, means systems. I mean, we need to have a systems thinking mentality. We tend to be reductionist and compartmentalized in the way we look at things. I think the Chinese are really good and naturally think systems. We don't think it as naturally as we should. And that's the reason why I think they're really good at building ecosystems. And of course, I think we're good at building platform-based ecosystems too, as Annika pointed out. But all of these things are interconnected. And the more we can understand how they're interconnected and how the economic system works and the role that private enterprise plays in that, and the way that institutions and regulations all impact the performance of the enterprise, the more we understand that in a holistic way, the better off we're likely to be.